So, some general things about coastal study, you already know. They're kind of quite dynamic, the edges of them, and so I've said the lines there are changing as somebody wants, through it and so on. But yeah, comparing maps, sometimes to places where I've done some field work, and when I've looked at the map and then looked at the GPS location, they kind of haven't matched, and obviously because the coast line's very interactive, that's basically the time. For example, erosion, coastlines receding, and on the other hand, deposition, where things are building up. These are really sloping. This one's down at Chongo Country Park, where there's land above the high water mark that isn't marked as such in the older Auckland survey maps. Quite a big area of it, and the same at Adelaide as well, which is what that first map was. So it's quite good fun figuring around response to the captions of these things as well. And birds, because this is mostly about vegetation, but everywhere the thing is obviously great. Huge slice of the ecological interest is birds, both breeding birds like organics and the others, and wintering birds like those widgeon. I haven't got very many photographs of birds I've taken in the area, but there's a few. And so going through sort of major habitat, broad habitat division, starting with salt marsh. And there's, what salt marshes are. It's a type of zone that gets covered by seawater for part of the time on a regular cycle. And depending on whether it's what we call upper, middle, or lower marsh, that makes a difference really to the kinds of vegetation and species of plants that we find there. So here, for example, this is an example of upper salt marsh, so at Tinian, which is one of the good areas, one of the better areas of salt marsh in the whole of the sort of Twit zone. But it's also very good for salt marsh as you go up the Firth or Forth towards Stirling. Great area of salt marsh there. So this is upper salt marsh with little dips, kind of like pans of ground that are more flooded and have a more kind of low salt marsh vegetation ecology. Starting with the lower end, species like glass, California, very characteristic of the lowest salt marsh zone. And the sort of lower to middle zone, these things like sea aster and the annual seed like the Sweda. You get in the sea aster is pretty common in the upper salt marsh zone, which is the bulk of our salt marsh really. You get a whole load of different plant species there, like the salt marsh rush, Gerardia, very, very common, and some species actually are really common in salt marsh and other kinds of coastal habitats, as well as inland. But we might not necessarily think of them as immediate relevant much of coastal species. Things like the pooch grass that a lot of people hate these, if it gets in their gardens, it causes problems for them. But one of its natural homes, possibly its main natural home, in really natural sense, is on the upper salt marsh zone. You can't really tell that it's pooch grass compared to other grasses from that photo. I was there and it was pooch grass, particular plant community was dominated by that species. And another one is red fescue. When we do work on vegetation of coastal habitats, whether it be salt marsh or sand dunes or maritime cliffs, we find red fescue as a species that's cropping up all the time, so much so that we can almost regard it as a particularly coastal species. It's obviously very, very, very common in land as well, but given that so much of inland Britain would be forest at one time, one could ask himself, where would the red fescue have been? Coastal habitats, all kinds, would be naturally speaking a major place for this very common species that we often do think about very much more in the fescue, taking a lead role in these coastal habitats. And it varies quite a bit, different forms of it, some with bluer leaves, others green and so on. And seed planting, and this that goes with pink to the scene. And then there's something not quite so common. It is like, for example, this Blismus, the Blismus rufus, salt marsh flatsedge. It's kind of mainly northern species in Britain, mainly around the Scottish coasts. It's a wee little thing with dark heads, and it forms patches, sometimes kind of striking patches going out, either along parallel to the upper salt marsh edge and sneaking out, and the patches going out to the salt marsh, looking kind of dark. It's quite a special thing, really. There's quite a lot of it in some places here in East Lothian. The salt marsh, Tinningham, the upper salt marsh zone there, it's pretty good for it, and it's also capital leading, I think, as well. So that's always a nice thing to find, easy to identify. Another one is the sea clubrush, big thing with dark heads and big bright green leaves going up the stems. Beautiful plant. It forms big tall stands where there's brackish water just coming into the upper salt marsh. Lovely plant. Then sea milkbird. This is very widespread all down the British coast. Absolutely beautiful little thing. You can walk out onto some salt marsh and people might look around and think, oh, it's just some dull green looking place. All looking much the same, but then you look close and you find all these other things, little plants in there, little rosettes of plantains and things, little creeping plants of this stuff, which I haven't taken a photo in flower there. Usually when I see it, it's not in flower, but it still looks beautiful. Just the leaves, and the leaves go a kind of yellowy orange colour in the autumn. Really nice plant. Very characteristic up in salt marsh zone. And these sea spurries as well, the greater and the lesser sea spurry, they both look very similar. Subtle difference in the sizes and shapes of the petals and sepals relative to each other. I drew a picture of it there for a talk I was once doing, and I hadn't got any pictures of that species, and then I found actually I have got one, I think, for this talk, so photos and some drawings. Beautiful little plants, look very small, creeps along in the upper salt marsh zone. This is quite speciality. It's mainly southern species, and it's called strawberry clover because when it's in fruit, they kind of look like strawberries. I've never actually tasted one to see. I'm sure they don't taste like strawberries at all. There's also a tree called strawberry tree, by the way, which we saw the other day. I've just come back yesterday from Barcelona, where we went to visit our daughter. My wife and I went there. Been there for a few days. And they have strawberry trees. You also get them in South West Island. And they've got these red fruits that look just like strawberries. Apparently they don't taste very nice, so my daughter said I should try them some weeks ago. Anyway, this thing is the leaves look a bit like white clover, but not quite, and the flowers are obviously different, pinkish, and fruits totally distinctive. Mainly the southern part. What we do find along the coasts is both in salt marsh zone and in other kind of habitats, is a bunch of species that in Britain as a whole are rather more southern, but which in the north do occur here and there, mainly in coastal habitats, which is not surprising really because they're right low down by the sea where the coldest temperatures, like the minimum temperatures, are not going to be that cold really. So some of them do creep up the coast here, and that's one thing. And then some northern species, by the way, a lot of our northern species of plants in Britain are kind of largely montane, hill-bound species, but there are some that are along the coast, and even people a little bit further south along the coasts. One thing I think about coasts is that not only are the minimum temperatures not too low, because of proximity to the sea, the maximum temperatures may not get too high, again because the sea kind of tempering the temperature regime. So we get kind of both the mix of more northern and more southern, as well as the widespread species. So it was a great plant, strawberry clover. That's a little upper salt marsh plants there. Another major habitat is the strand line, which you could call it the strand line, high water mark, it's kind of the same thing really. And a narrow kind of zone along the high water mark, and it's quite subject to disturbance, really, from the water coming up the background, being that the substrates, largely either sand or stones, shingly stones, or a mix of the two, as here. This is on the coast of West Lothian. West Lothian doesn't have very much coast, by the way. Don't really think of it as, let's go to the West Lothian coast for a day, you know. But my wife and I have been doing all these surveys for TWIC, which has been great, and an awful lot have been in West Lothian, most of them, and some in Edinburgh as well, Edinburgh Council Zone. And these West Lothian ones, they've all been fascinating, and it's been great to discover more of West Lothian and to see its coastline, which I found myself on earlier this year in summer. So we get these kind of untidy, rather weedy looking assemblages of plants along that strand line zone. It's fascinating zone, really. Like the sea rocket, it's one beautiful plant with kind of pale, lighter, whitish flowers and fleshy sort of leaves. A lot of coastal plants have these fleshy leaves, so halo-like plants. That photograph was actually taken in final site I was surveying this year, which is actually outside Twixen. It's just across the water. I have got photographs of that same species from this side, but that was actually a better photograph, so I put that in. This is a great plant, sea sandwort. It really goes for that sort of edge zone there. I always think it looks a bit like an imitation plant because the leaves and the stems, they're very kind of thick textured and fleshy. It's like if somebody made a plant, a model plant, out of some plasticky, rubbery material, and said, how about this? And everything was all so regular, stacked. The leaves are really thick and they're opposite pairs and then at right angles to each other. It's the kind of thing you might look at and say, no, you want to make something that looks a bit more natural than that. That looks so artificial. People are going to suss that it's just made up. But actually nature has done that, you know. It's a great plant. You get whole patches of it. This is over at Tinningham on a kind of upper edge of the rocky shore where there's all big patches of this stuff. It's a great thing. What's next? I'm saying what's next because, like I said, I've been waiting a few days and just come back and thinking, what the hell have I got in these photographs? But the photographs themselves kind of act as a wee prompt. Oh yeah, the photograph of that, so I can find something to say about it. Here's another one of that strand line zone. The prickly saltwort. It is pretty prickly. Well, I've never actually grabbed hold of it and tested it to see how much it hurts, but I'm sure it would. And it's nothing like as common as that previous one. So it's actually quite a special plant. It's more common further south. And here it is at Long Nibby. Some years ago, I was doing some botanical and survey work for building and that was one of the species impact. Oh yeah, these things, oranges. Quite notoriously tricky to identify some of these, particularly they're all kind of greyish green, some of it kind of more grey and possibly colours, and leaf shapes varying from long and thin, as in that species on the left, to sort of broader and lobed, a bit like kind of maple leaves. So there's three of the commoner ones there. And they're kind of weedy looking things, usually with a lot of space around them. They probably wouldn't compete very well in a very thick, dense sward. But the thing about the strand line zone is it's good for species that wouldn't really compete against lots and lots of other plants right up against them. Because there's always space and that kind of disturbance of the tide coming in and out along that edge helps to keep conditions a bit open for these plants. Silverweed's another one. It's very, very common, and you probably all know the species. And it has those yellow flowers, a bit like tormented flowers, but bigger. And the leaves are kind of silvery underneath. In that photo, there are no flowers, and you can't see the silvery underside to the leaves. But I chose that photo because it shows all those runners, an incredible, complex sort of pattern of those runners on the beach. amazing how the plant just spreads there and forms patterns with the green stems. And this is the upper kind of very upper salt marsh strand line edge on the west coast of Scotland, because the Twick zone, thinking back to that map, it comes down to the shores of Loch Long near Arrocha. That's the village of Arrocha, back on the left there. So it actually has a little bit of the west coast as well. It's mainly south of Scotland, but a wee bit of west coast habitat. I was at this location earlier this year, and my wife and I were doing some work over there, because we've done a lot of our works in the West Highlands. And I found the hemlock water droplet there. Actually, it grows on this coast as well, but it prompted me to write, this is a poison plant and it smells horrible. And here we are, very, very short. The weather feels pleasant and the views look fine, but there's a poisonous plant on the tidal line. And a lot of rotten seaweeds, and the stench is strong, a heavy scent of welcome to the great Loch Long. So, Arrocha is probably not famous as I don't know, I might say, without being best, it's not famous as a wonderfully pretty kind of place. It's a main road was quite fluid and busy. But actually it's okay. We stayed in a hotel there. I've got some pretty bad reviews online, but it's actually really good. It's often quite good to go to places where everybody's saying, don't go there, and there's bad reviews about it, because it's one thing, I suppose, good chance it's going to turn out better than you expect, and that could be in different ways, not just a particular things like bad hotel reviews, it might be other things. Like here, I was finding, you can't see it in this photo, but there's some trees just along the edge of the water there, with lots of interesting epiphytes going on, mosses and liverworts especially, including some quite special species that are very sensitive to atmospheric pollution and that can make a comeback since pollution levels, so sulfur dioxide and things like that. That's a coastal area there, it's really good for them. So yeah, it's pretty good. You can't see it there, I stretched the word along to so much that you can't even see the entire word. I thought, how long should I stretch it to obviously to keep within the limits, because I got that picture at the top right, and I thought, no, to hell with it, I'll make it go behind that. So make it even longer. Straight fun, I like doing that. Artificial shoreline habitats, because it's not just like sort of marsh, sand dunes, sand line, mountain cliffs. There's other things that are artificial. Actually, one of our surveys for Twick was at this place on the northwest edge of Edinburgh, which included quite a length of coastline, part of which was like this. Fascinating place, actually. The various non-native species, which themselves are pretty interesting in these urban and semi-urban habitats. It's fascinating to see the contribution that non-native species make, as long as they're not invasive. Obviously, things that are invasive can give you a problem. Things like rhododendrons, serious bad news. But here we found like parsnip. That's not painted up here. Wasn't causing any trouble, like ecologically it seems to be. But there was for all sorts of other things. Some kind of sunflower, miniature sunflower, not too far away. Fascinating places. And there'll be native plants in there, especially native plants that are not very good competitors. Again, it's a lot of space amongst all these untidy ground, substrate, stone, disturbed things. So that's pretty interesting. Obviously, though, actually, some of those non-natives, can be a bit invasive. Here's one of them. Along the coast, one of the commoner things that is a bit of a problem is the Japanese roses and goza. It looks very nice with those big pink flowers, which is probably why I bought it here in the first place, like the rhododendron. But yeah, once it gets out and about, especially into ground where the competition with other species is on the low side, then coasts particularly, then it really can get going. that was in that same area, the coast. Sand dunes, major habitats, and East Lothian is really, really good for them. The whole Twick area, within the Twick area, East Lothian is probably the best actually area there for sand dune habitats. Big extensive ones, places like Aberlady, very well known, but also further east along Nidri, Yellowthroat here, and then down by Tinman towards Dunbar. Great mix of sand dune habitats. And there's lots of variations, obviously, there's not just all dune. There's a lot of variation from the seaward front, this is just in from what would be the kind of tide mark. And there's these species that can thrive where competition is very low, the habitat is very unstable with wind-blown sand, lots of comings and goings, sand deposition and erosion over time. This little grass, the sand couch is one of the ones that's often right at the very edge of that vegetation zone. And then the lime grass can be sort of the next one in sometimes. If we're using the National Vegetation Classification, by the way, we have different communities for these. This one there would be SD4 and SD5, but let's not get into the ones in the codes of the NBC for this purpose. But suffice to say that it does help us to understand the zonation, the habitat tolerance of these different plants. This is a great thing, the lime grass, wonderful glaucous colour. And then marrow, which is hugely extensive, is really, really well known, covers vast areas of sand dunes and helps to bind the sand together. And the sand sedge herricks are an area which creeps underground with those rhizomes, and they put up shoots often in a line, little rosettes. So those plants all do very well on the relatively unstable sand, and the marrow gets really common right through to where it's more stable as well. And there are mosses in these places and lichens as well. That one on the left, Syntrichia aureliformis, is really, really common through miles of sand dunes. Beautiful plant. The one on the right looks superficially a little bit similar in that its leaves spread out in all directions and it's got little white points at the ends of the leaves, but it's actually quite rare. They're called Racemitrium canescens. But there's a decent population of it at yellow grey in sort of short turf, where it's quite line rich as well. Where it's a more fixed dune, we could call it, a little bit more stable. Although you can see there's a bit of erosion happening there, but it's, for the most part, a bit more stable. So you often get a richer mix of plants, a kind of thicker sward with lots of little herbs and things, including some that are a bit more southern in their distributions in Britain, like purple milkvetch and the pyramidal orchid. That was a cavalier, that's a special site for it there, because it's really rare in Scotland, that orchid. And the purple milkvetch, East Lothian, is a good area for that. Some more of these. These are things that are in coastal, more fixed dune kind of habitats along the coast of East Lothian. They're more common down south, where they go well in land as well. So it's nice to see those. And the Scots lovage, this is a northern species, so we get this mix of northern and southern. That can be in sand dunes, and it also likes to grow on rocky cliffs. A beautiful plant, quite fleshy leaves, undelicate, like parsley and those species. Really kind of lush looking thing. Sea holly, that is not northern again, it's more kind of widespread, it's like southern. The beautiful plant, quite unmistakable, there's a good lot of that at John Muir Country Park. And that Viper's bugloss, very distinctive, more widespread in all kinds of coastal, sandy, slightly bearish places, and it's really good for those hermit moths. And lichens, they feature in some of these sand dunes. You get a great abundance of some of these cladonia lichens, these bushy, whitish things, in places, especially where in the northeast part of Britain. And if you go further northeast, like in Europe, to Scandinavia, then even more so, you get this kind of snowy cover of lichens like that in various habitats from the woods out into the montane hill-ground communities. And we get this kind of bit of an indication of that within Britain in the northeastern parts, from the hills down to the coasts, and locally have great abundance of these cladonia lichens. It's partly a climatic thing, it seems to get really abundant in the relatively cool and not too wet climate of northeastern Britain. And that's at Durham. There's good quantities of that lichen, those mixed cladonias with marron grass and sand sedge. And we get heaths, sandy heaths, with heather and bell heather and sand sedge and scrub. Sea buckthorn is very common. It's found as a non-native here, but when you go to the border into Northumberland, it's marked as native. And it's often seen as a problem actually here because it can take over. And juniper, it's great to see juniper here and there. There's not very much of it in the coasts over here. We get more populations of it in the hills. But it is a feature of some of the northeastern coastal sites. And I'll press on, so I don't want to be taking too long. It's about 10 minutes. Dune slacks are another feature of dunes and the dips in them. It's wetter, we get a mix of sedges and herbs. It's a wetland environment, basically. And Aberlady is a particularly good site for dune slacks. We also see them at places like Yellowberry with dune slacks in there. This is an example of one that's really species rich, loads of sedges and herbs, swampy bits in it there with bogbean, loads of good stuff. And variegated horsetail, that's quite a rare kind of horsetail with which there are really good populations at Aberlady and some of the short dune slack vegetation, beautiful plant. Marsh stitchbird, that's at Aberlady as well, but kind of rather a rarity this far north. It's more southern in Britain generally. And it's there in the dune slack. Another one is the little tiny yellow sedge. It's the relative of the common yellow sedge, very extensive, but it's small fruited. There's good populations of that in there. And creeping willow is really common in dune slacks in lots of parts of Britain. Don't tend to see so much of it really around here in the dunes, but locally there is a bit here. But lockhouses on the coast of East Lothian. Nice to see creeping willow there. Northern marsh orchid, a good dune slack species here. Black bogrush, genus Nigropan, is very, very rare on the east coast, and that's near Gullen. And finally, non-dune habitats that are above the high water mark. So it includes cliffs and other kinds of heaths and grasslands. That's some coastal heath there at Tinningham. So it's not on sandy ground, it's on the mineral soil. Cliffs, great cliffs, and the Twig area includes these ones down in the borders, which are superb, big cliffs, and of course, let's be careful where we go with these places. But it's a wild habitat, it's proper, good big wild cliff, the likes of which we see more of further north in Scotland. So it's great to have part of that in the Twig zone here. With these wild rocky shores, different habitats. Good for lichens on the rocks, different zonations of lichens, those sort of yellow xanthorrhizal lichens and those Ramalina species, Ramalina silicuosa there with xanthorrhizal, and thrift and Scots lovage on the rocks there. Good important places for lichens. Here's a northern species, the woodvetch, growing not far from the southern parline thistle on a cliffy slope in the borders, mainly mix of northern and southern. Neither of those two species are very common at all in Scotland. And that cranesbill, Geranium sanguineum, various parts of the coast of East Lothian, good for that, where the soils are quite rich. And the rudely saxifrage on thin soil with the base enrichments. That's increasing now, including in urban areas. This liverwort, Porella obtusata, does like a very mild climate, and it's not very common on the east coast at all. It's more western. So it's nice to see some of that over here on rock. There's bits of woodland and scrub. It's a drawing I did with some woodland tinning and then photos of some elder scrub. You get bits of those on the coast. And some of the common species, ivy, get big patches of that on some cliffs. Common reed, you get in the upper salt marsh zone here and there. Funnily enough, I mean, we think of common reed as very much a wetland species, swamps and fens and things. And it can go on to more sloping ground. And if somebody were to say, hey, how about a plant community that's got loads of common reed, Phragmites, and underneath it there's loads of ivy, which we find generally on dry ground, people might think, that's a good idea. Imaginary, silly plant communities that obviously don't exist. Well, there's a place on the coast, the borders, it was by Coben's Path, I think it was, where some years ago I went to these cliffs. And I could see some Phragmites growing up there, and there's a wee path going. And from this path, you just step off it here and there, and it was going through all this Phragmites, and underneath the Phragmites was a carpet of ivy. But so some things that might sound a stupid idea actually do exist. So that's about it, really. Just the photograph at the end, nice peaceful coastline. Because we can get so wrapped up in all sorts of complex thoughts. The coastline is another good place to just get away from all that. And I must also mention some of these organisations who are very much involved in all the plant recording, conservation work, not just in the coastal zone, but more generally. We've got some representations from them here. Part by the SBI and the FDNS, National Plant Monitoring Scheme, run largely through Plant Life, great projects like citizen science, checking out how things are changing up and down the country. That's it.